My name is Amir, and I think we should start. I would like to present Dr. Amir Locker-Biletzki, whose work is a very interesting investigation of the historical, ideological, and practical stand Israeli leaders and members of the Communist Party had expressed vis-a-vis the British imperial policies and the Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine and later on in Israel. So in a way, his work is an effort to register the interesting ideological and political stands vis-a-vis two major constructs, the British imperial colonial approach and the Zionist project, from a very unique perspective of Israeli communists, some of them Arabs, some of them Jews. Today, Amir is going to speak about one ideological leader of the Communist Party, Moshe Sneh, and it will be very interesting to hear. Amir was a postdoc in Azrieli Institute for the last year, and this is his presentation in our department, the sociology department. So, Amir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Moore, for the kind words. Cheva, Professor Nicolini, thank you. And thank you for Jennifer for organizing this whole thing. I'm a bit excited, not just because of the event itself, but because it's the first result of the research that I'm working quite feverishly in the last 6 months or so. So this is the first presentation of what I'm working for. Hopefully at the end of the book. Okay, so the name of the presentation is The Settler and the Colonized Consciousness of Israeli Communists. That starts. Moshe Sneh casts a long shadow over the history of the Israeli anti-Zionist left. By far, one of the most important political figures to cross the lines from Zionism to Marxist anti-Zionism, and back again. His political and theoretical moves from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s were the subject of deep emotional controversy. The aim of this talk is not to try to solve the mystery surrounding Sneh, meaning understanding his political twists and turns, but to try to understand his theories as one of the leading Marxist thinkers in Israel of the 1950s. The main text that will be examined in this paper is the book pompously named On the National Questions, Conclusions in the Light of Marxism, Leninism, really rolls off the mouth. One former member of Maki, the Israeli Communist Party, and Banki, the Israeli Young Communist League, characterized the book as written in a dense Marxist style, accompanied by many citations from the scriptures, and at the same time, noting that the prose is fluent, as is usual in Sneh's writing. I can attest to that, it's a quite fluent book. The book prefigured Sneh's rejection of Zionism in favor of Marxist anti-Zionism. It was written as an ideological text for Sneh's party, and sums up the position he would bring when he joined, him and his followers, when he joined Maki. The main thrust of the book is to disprove some of the basic fundamentals of Zionism. However, by rejecting Zionism, using the terms of Marxism-Leninism, Sneh creates the ideological possibility of an Israeli non-Zionist national identity. The basic ideological premises on the national question is based derive from Lenin's understanding of national self-determination and imperialism, as well as Stalin's conceptualization of the nation. In his theoretical work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1916, Lenin explains the spread of European empire as originating in a change in the formation of capital itself. Basing himself on economic data, Lenin argues that the concentration of production in the hands of the Bets, which deploy their control by granting or withholding credit, had made them into a powerful monopolies, ushering a new stage in the development of capitalism, different from the one in Marx's days. Instead of the old capitalism, when free competition prevailed and where the export of goods was the most typical feature, under modern capitalism, when monopolies prevail, the export of capital has become the typical feature. In place of the individual captains of industry and manufacturing, countries like England and that traded goods in the world markets, in the last quarter of the 19th century, monopolist capitalist combines in a few rich countries had proliferated. This reconfiguration of wealth and control has resulted, Lenin argues, in an enormous superabundance of capital, accumulating in the advanced countries. This surplus of financial capital is then exported to overseas colonies, as the big imperial powers have divided the world between them. The rise of nationalism, we are moving on, with its integrative messages meant to bond together all classes of society in one nation identity, stood in contrast to Marxism. Marx and Engels offer no systematic understanding of the nation and national movements. This lacuna in Marxist theorization was soon filled by a group of thinkers associated with the Second International. Socialists of different shades proposed different solutions to the rise of nationalism in Europe. The Social Democrat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, confronted by the bewildering number of ethnic groups in the dual kingdom, including Ruthenians, that's Western Ukrainians of some sort, Czechs, Germans, etc., formalized an understanding of nationalism under the heading of Austro-Marxism. At the core of this theoretical construct stood a cultural autonomy in the framework of a multinational state. The Austro-Marxists advocated an arrangement of nationalities into public judicial cooperation with series of cultural, administrative, and legal powers. While the Austrian socialists were formulating their ideas about in Central Europe, Eastern Europe's Jewish Pale of Settlement witnessed another understanding of the nation, the Bund, General Jewish Labor Bund of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. I think some of you know it. Was founded in 1897 to address the economic needs of Jewish workers, most of them working in Jewish-owned small workshops, unable to compete with the cheap non-Jewish workforce. But by 1901, its strictly economic policies took a national cultural turn, pressed to express an ethnic commonality of all Jews. Struggling to pursue its class fight against Jewish capitalists while maintaining its ties to Russian social democracy, the Bund recognized the Jews as a nation. As a result, the Bundists demanded that Russian Jews be accorded national cultural autonomy in a future Russian republic. In staunch opposition to these attempts to reconcile socialism and nationalism stood Rosa Luxemburg, of Polish Jewish origin and a German citizen, and one of the foremost theoreticians of the Second International. Her views about nationalism developed under the conditions of Russian-ruled Poland. In 1893, Luxemburg founded the Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Poland, also known as SDKP. The SDKP accused the Polish Socialist Party, a rival organization, the PPS, which supported Polish independence from Russia in favoring Polish patriotism over socialism. Luxemburg argued that the idea of Polish independence was unattainable on economic grounds. Instead, she advocated for Poland to move towards territorial autonomy. In 1896, in the wake of the Second International Congress in London, Luxemburg formalized her argument, saying that, from an economic point of view, Poland was already integrated into Russia. While Poland's industrial growth was reliant on Russian markets, the longing for independence was based on pre-modern, pre-industrial segments of Polish society. In 1908, she further elaborated her attack on nationalism, denying the right of self-determination and arguing that it is an abstract and metaphysical right. She added that supporting national movement bids for secession is supporting the national bourgeoisie. She concluded by saying that the right of small nations, included to national liberation, is utopian and contrary to the laws of history. These arguments aroused Lenin's ire. In this context, the Russian Bolsheviks, confronted by the Russian Empire's multinational makeup, fashioned their own understanding of nationalism. Their understanding was based on Lenin's reaffirmation of the concept of self-determination and on Stalin's definition of the nation. In both cases, Stalin and Lenin formulated their theories in direct polemics with Austro-Marxism, Bundist nationalism, and Luxembourg unbridled internationalism. Both Lenin and Stalin viewed the nation as the product of concrete, historical, economic process. As Lenin put it, the categorical requirement of Marxist theory in investigating any social question is to be examined within definite historical limits. He then places nationalism in a social context. Lenin, like other Marxists of his time, differentiates between two eras of capitalism. The first is the rise of the new social system from the ruins of feudalism and absolutism. This period was characterized by the formation of a bourgeoisie democratic society and state, when the national movement, for the first time, became mass movements. And in one way or another, drew all classes of the population into politics. Spurred by the appearance of mass media, the press, and representative democracy, nations sought national independence. The second era of developed capitalism. In this one, the period is of fully formed capitalist state, with a long-established constitutional regime and highly developed antagonism between proletariat and bourgeoisie. In this era, the different nations, drawn more closely together by commerce, will intermingle to an increasing degree, thus bringing the antagonism between internationally united capital and the international working class movement into the forefront. Lenin goes on to place nationalism in the context of autocratic Tsarist Russia of the early 20th century, arguing that the Russian Empire's archaic structure contrasts with the more developed capitalism of Poland. Therefore, in sharp disagreement with Luxembourg, the economic gap between the countries is what makes Polish nationalism and self-determination possible. Comparable argumentation can be found in Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, 1913. Much like Lenin, he places the nation in a historical and socio-economic context, stating that a nation is not merely a historical category, but a historical category belonging to a definite epoch, the epoch of rising capitalism. While nations formed nation-state in advanced capitalist Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, multinational states developed. These states, most characteristically Russia and Austro-Hungary, are the product of feudal systems. As Stalin phrased it, the peculiar method of formation of state could take place only, or this peculiar method of formation of state could take only place only where feudalism has not yet been eliminated. When capitalism did penetrate the East, awakening the small nations of the multinational empires, those nations' nationalism clashed with the nationalism of the dominant nations. So, small nations like the Polish against the Russians, that's the idea. Beside the particular context in which Stalin places national movements, earlier in the text he conceptualized the model of a nation, opening with the question, what is a nation? He describes it as primarily a community, a definite community of people. However, a multilingual empire like Russia is also a stable community. Therefore, explains Stalin, what distinguishes a national community is one national language, concluding that community of language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Yet different nations communicate at times in the same language, like the English-speaking British and Americans. Therefore, what separates them, according to Stalin, is territory. Different nations are therefore also characterized by a community of territory. Yet linguistic and territorial unity are not all that defines a nation. This, says Stalin, requires an internal economic bond which welds the various parts of the nation into a single whole. At this point, he turns from the materialistic to the cultural fundamentals of the nation. Stalin argues that nations are formed by their dissimilar conditions of existence, which support the development of different spiritual features. Although these traits may be hard to delineate, this process manifests itself in a distinctive culture common to the nation. Discrete aspects of a nation, Stalin defines it. Here he is with Donald Trump back. It is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in common culture. Using this theoretical classification, Stalin disproves the nationalist understanding of the Austro-Marxist and the Bund. He basically argues that the absence of one part of his national formula disqualifies their nationalist claims. Stalin and Lenin's understandings of nationalism are no doubt at times mechanical, reflecting an internationalist creed that found it hard to wholeheartedly accept nationalism. Nonetheless, they had an immense impact on Israeli communists. Applying these Leninist, Stalinist concepts to Palestine and Israel opened a space for local identities. In his 1954 text, written on the eve of his and his followers' entry to Maki, the Israeli Communist Party, Snare refutes Zionism in order to justify a local Israeli national identity detached from Zionism. In the opening, he states that the book will help to understand, or will help us to understand, on the one hand, the bourgeoisie reactionary nature of Zionist ideology, and on the other hand, our affinity to the motherland as guardians of national independence. He starts with a sweeping survey of the development of the nation in Marxist terms, from prehistory to modernity. When he arrives at the chapter titled The Bourgeoisie Nation, he follows Stalin's and Lenin's readings. This is most clearly evident in the following words. The nation was historically formed as a result of a territorial, linguistic, economic, and cultural association of a stable community of people as an outcome of capitalist development. Moving from feudal to capitalist system, he notes that the formation of nation is not yet over. Mainly in the colonial world, where capitalism is not fully formed and feudal relations survive. The process of the development of nation is not yet done. Having outlined the more theoretical parts of his analysis, Snare approaches the history and the national development of the Jews. After asserting that Jewish history is like any other history or of any other people, the history of the social economic formation that it went through during its development, he proceeds to chart a Marxist history of the Jews. His detailed analysis culminates with the disavowal of the Jewish and Zionist national idea of an extraterritorial eternal nation. Here again, Snare uses Stalinist language. Any talk about all contemporary Jews worldwide as one nation is mocking reality. Truth and common sense. Historical materialism proved that only the combination of four shared markers historically formed in a stable community, territory, language, economy, and culture, creates the nation. From the arguments about the globalist nature of Jewish nationhood, Snare turns to the target of his polemics, Zionism. In a chapter titled Zionism, the means of the Jewish, Israeli, and imperialist bourgeoisie, he uses Leninist analysis of imperialism as his theoretical weaponry against Zionism. He opens with the class definition of Zionism. It is, he states, the principal nationalist reactionary ideology of the Jewish bourgeoisie. He then launches into an extensive historical narrative of how the Zionists dealt with various powers. He first defines the imperialism according to the basic Leninist outline, with the development of capitalism to its monopolistic stage, then to imperialism as the second phase of the national question. This is how he defines it. In this era of ascendant imperialism, the Western nation states like England, France, Italy, or the US cast their rule over colonial peoples. National oppression at this stage is one of the forms of exploitation of finance capital that extends beyond national borders, seeking more markets, raw materials, and fuel, and more places in which to invest capital and land, what is called expert capital. From this basic Leninist definition, Sneh goes on to chart a historical narrative of the links between Zionism and imperialism, between Zionism and the Ottoman, French, German, Russian, British empires. In his arguments regarding French imperial intentions in the Levant, he claims that Baron de Rothschild, while in effect turning Jewish colonies in Palestine into undeveloped farms or plantations built on cheap labor, meant to use them as a channel for French capital and influence in Eretz Israel and the Near East. However, most preferred of all other political links of the Zionist movement was the one with Britain. Recounting the history of Zionist-British relations, Sneh asserts that the Zionist movement, from its origins, offered itself as a tool to different imperialist powers and became, by the end of World War I and afterward, a tool in the hands of British imperialism. As British business interests moved into Palestine, the Zionist movement and its leadership merged as subordinates with British imperialism. When that dependency was no longer possible, the Zionist movement increased its links with the American imperialism, subordinating Israel to it after 1948. At the end of this line of argumentation, Sneh manages, according to his ideological preferences, of course, to disavow Zionism and the underlying assumption that it is a legitimate national movement. At the same time, while disavowing one form of nationalism, he accords another acceptability. In a chapter titled Aliyah, Settlement, Independence, that is not Zionism, he rejects the notion that Zionism is the prime mover behind the building of the Yeshuv, the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, and the state of Israel. This idea is a false perception borrowed from idealistic thinking. He sets out to prove that not the Zionist idea created the Aliyah, settlement, defense, and independence. Rather, they were formed by the class need of the bourgeoisie, the upper class. The immigration to Palestine was not an ideologically motivated and not an answer to the Jews' plight in the form of the ingathering of the exiles, kibbutz galuyot. But part of the sweep of Jewish and global migration, mainly from Europe to the New World. Sneh sees the economic growth of the Jewish presence in Palestine as the result of a capitalist development. In this Leninist scheme, Zionism was used to channel British imperialist capital as well as Jewish private capital to fuel the country's economy and exploit its working class. The import of foreign investment, mainly American after 1948, is stifling Israel's manufacture and development and preventing the development of the Israeli national industry, in effect denying Israel economic independence. The end product of Sneh's argument is the creation of a non-Zionist Israeli local nationalism. This crucial element is seen already earlier in the text. While rejecting the extraterritorial nature of Jewish peoplehood, he adds that the communist movement acknowledges the nation that is formed in Israel. He further elaborates on the point later in the text. In a chapter aptly called The Struggle for Independence, he outlines concisely how this new nation was formed. The capitalist development of the Jewish Yishuv on part of Eretz Israel is one that caused the development of the nation. British imperialist rule restricted the development of the nation that was being formed and subjugated it to a regime of national oppression and colonial exploitation. Thus, from the combination of Stalinist and Leninist understandings, Sneh denationalizes the Jewish people and nationalizes the Jews in Israel. By using Leninist reading of 19th century imperialism to disavow Zionism, he creates a local Israeli identity. Sneh makes a radical argument that subverts many of the fundamentals of Zionism. He theorizes into existence an Israeli identity, detached from Zionism. However, it is manifestly Israeli Jewish identity that takes upon itself many elements of the Zionist project. Sneh is cognizant of the effects of the Zionist settler colonialism had on the Palestinians. His political stands are radical for the time, calling for Palestinian self-determination in an independent state and the return of the refugees. His understanding of class formation and capital transfer in Palestine, Israel, are not divorced from historical realities. However, he lacks a comprehensive understanding, which other communists had, of the colonial logic of Zionism. Communist ideology decreed that at the root of the hostility between Jews and Arabs lies the malevolent scheming of imperialism. Loyal to this article of faith, Sneh attributes the colonial policies of Zionism to Western, mostly British and also American, but here British, imperialism, as he tellingly phrases it. British imperialist rule tried by any means possible to direct the Arab movement away from it and against the Jewish Yishuv. The Zionist leadership did, on its part, everything to help the British rulers to fan the flames of hostility between Arabs and Jews, according to the old principle of divide and rule. Every case of dispossession of tenant falahim from the land, every picketing of avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor, which prevented workers from being employed at a Jewish proprietor. The clause in the Jewish National Fund Constitution that bars Arabs from working its lands. The systematic refraining from any Jewish Arab corporation in the political, economic, social fields. All that helped British imperialism to provoke Jews and Arabs. With that in mind, Sneh asserts that Palestinian nationalism lacks any anti-colonial context and national agency. He names it as the National Liberation Movement of the Arab people of Eretz Israel, defining it as an agrarian reform movement which also sought national independence. Not exactly a great endorsement there. The Palestinian citizens of Israel are seen in this context as the subject of a struggle which is in essence for civil rights, not national rights. Sneh followers, soon to be Maki members, are encouraged to bitterly struggle against Jewish nationalism as our Arab comrades struggle against Arab nationalism. Why did Sneh not construct an Israeli identity that would not be so manifestly Israeli Jewish and be able to include the Palestinians in Israel? Why could he not comprehend the colonial logic of Zionism? Part of the answer is to be found in the theoretical tools that he used. As Marxism-Leninism did not develop a more nuanced understanding of settler colonial situation. it is clear that SNE can't be blamed for not understanding historical realities with theories that are outside his time, i.e. settler colonialism. However, other Maki ideologists did grasp aspects of Zionist colonialism. Here the answer lies within the context of SNE's awareness and his intended audiences, consciousness, let's say. The people that he is talking to in the context of an emerging Israeli far left are the product of the Zionist settler project. This is evident from the portrayal of his followers as young people that came to the party straight from the mainstream of Israeli society. Most of them were native-born veterans of the youth movements, kibbutz members, in short, people that came from the heart of the yeshuv. These young men and women, many of them had fought in the 1948 war in the elite Palmach, striking units, brought the Zionist settler colonial project to its culmination, a national settler state. Thus, SNE, in his text, reflects their understanding of the historical reality they themselves and SNE took part in. While their understanding differed radically from Zionist conventions, it still failed to understand fully Zionism and its impact on the Palestinian natives of the land. So I want to thank you, and also Comrade Stalin, thank you.
We can open now for a question, if you want. We have.
Now I have an important question. Does anybody have a pen? One thing I forgot. So I'm going to write something. Thank you.
Okay. Please.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Amir. This was a very thought-provoking presentation. Very nicely delivered. Thank you very much. I really learned a lot. And some of the conversations that we had, I battled you. I certainly don't agree with everything that certainly Moshe Sneh had to say, but that's maybe a debate actually between him and me.
He turned back from all of that.
So that's actually something that I want to ask you about. Can you say a few words, about the development of his thought? If I heard you and if I understood the presentation correctly, much of what you told us is based on his 1954 work,
yeah.
Right? So can you put that in the context of his own intellectual and political growth and development? At the very beginning of the talk, you made reference to his party switching, and certainly that gives us an idea of where he started out, at least as far as his political career in the state of Israel is concerned. But even like if you could just locate this argument in the overall intellectual growth of Sneh, that would be very helpful. And my other question related to that is, why Sneh? Why did you choose him as the case, if you will, to tell us the story of the settler colonial consciousness of Israeli communists? Why do you think that he is the best model, if you will, to introduce this work to us?
Okay. First of all, to the first question, I'm not a SNE expert, and he has, I think, 5 volumes of his writings. There's a man named Yair Tzaban, which was his protege, and make sure that his legacy would live on. He fluctuates. He started as a liberal Zionist. He started as a protege of Greenbaum in Poland, and by 23, he's a maverick. He's an interesting man by himself, and a very, very capable man. Probably if he would stay in the mainstream, he wouldn't end up the way he ended up, sort of in the sidelines. But he started as a liberal Zionist, and he starts to move left probably when he's in Paris with Ben-Gurion as his chief military advisor, the Ramash LaHagana, the head of the chief of staff of the Hagana. He starts to move to the left because he understands that, or he thinks he understands that the rising power is the Soviet Union, and in order to ensure that, and this is his motivation, and he always says it even after he splits from the Arab-Jewish Maki, he said, I thought that the Soviet Union, the rise of the Soviet Union as a rising power, can safeguard the existence of the Jewish people. and the state of Israel. And he moves in his definition, what is the Jewish people, okay? So in this point where I catch him in 1954, when he breaks with Zionism, he disavows the Jews as one nation. After the split in 1965, as he moves more and more to the right and moves his followers to the right, that's basically they disintegrate. They become a communist party that slowly just vanishes. He started to talk about the Jewish people once again in sort of a Zionist concept. In his political will that he dictates to Yair Tzaban in 1972, he recounts this whole, not the text itself, but his whole turn against Zionism. He says, I'm sorry about it, although he never said that I'm returning to Zionism. Ideologically, completely, now I'm a Zionist, I wasn't before. Okay? From my point of view, what he did to the Communist Party was detrimental. He destroyed the possibility of a large, more rooted Jewish far left when he split the party in '65. He's very much responsible for the splitting of the party. There are some Rakach members, if you say snare on them, they will start a little shaking. Anyway, why snare? First of all, intellectual. You should read the things that you read. The guy knows how to write. That's one thing. Intellectually, probably in the 1950s, in the Communist Party, he's the foremost, most important intellectual, Jewish intellectual. From the Palestinian side, which is not really mentioned here, there were a few large caliber intellectuals. But from the Jewish part of the party, he's the most eloquent intellectual. And this book, takes this group of few hundred people, and this is the book that makes them into communists in a very Israeli context. This is why I choose him. Mm-hmm. In the 11 years that he was in the party as a party leader, the book was on every shelf of any communist, down the lot, but any Israeli communist, at least the ones that read Hebrew. Okay, so it was a very important, ideological turn. And in terms, and I haven't looked at it too much, but if you look at his rivals from the left, which is Mapam, there is a rivalry between Mapam and Maki, who's more Marxist. They refer to the book, they attack the book, so there is a lot of intellectual ferment around Sneh and his book. He's the most important, let's say, defector. The most important, we have to understand his place in Israel. This is someone that stood at the pinnacle of power of when the state was forming in the late 1940s. The chief of staff of the Haganah, this is almost the official army. And he renounced all of that for communism. So this is why I chose him. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a little confused, and probably me, but there seems to be an element of paradox here. Because on the one hand, using the perspective of Lenin and Stalin, we have the argument put forward that unlike Zionism, universalism, Israel society does meet the requirements of a nation state in terms of language, culture, economy, and so forth.
Yeah.
But then we turn around and say, but it's not really a nation state because it's really a product of imperialism. It's really a British colony in effect. So which is it? Is it a distinct nation state based on commonalities, or is it just a group of people that serve colonial interests? So this is one part that I'm having difficulty with, because it seems to me those two ideas are in conflict. The second thing that I'm wondering about, again, is in theoretical terms, socialism or communism is supposed to be universal, and I don't remember, and it may be me, the Israeli communists making much fuss of doing anything with the Palestinians. Supposedly, if we're all universal brothers, then there should have been some attempt made to come to terms with the Palestinian Arabs. But as far as I know, very little of that was done. So how does that fit in to the idea of the leftist umbrella?
Okay, let's start with the paradox. The Jewish communist, and it's a recurrent theme, I just wrote about it yesterday, it's a recurrent theme in the history of the party since the 1920s. Make a distinction between Zionism. Zionism is an ideology. An ideology in Marxist language is something that can come and go, which doesn't have real roots. It's something that the ruling classes teaches you in order to agree to the social order. So Zionism is an ideology that manifests a certain class, the Jewish bourgeoisie, which is connected to British imperialism. And when they come to Palestine with their money, basically, okay, they serve the great master. But there is a distinction between the Jews, which are not necessarily Zionist, or they're just brainwashed or something along those lines, and Zionism. The idea is that there is a nation which is not Zionist. It can be Jewish, people can have some, these cultural traits that they brought with them, but they, as a nation, are not necessarily Zionist. The task sort of the communist is, because the task of the communists is to reveal to those masses that first of all, their interest lies with the other natives of the land, which is the Palestinian, in a joint struggle, political struggle, against Zionism. And when you fight against Zionism, you also fight against imperialism. British imperialism, after that American imperialism. Because the British go away at one point and they need to find another enemy. Now,
Yeah, but I may interrupt for a second.
Yeah,
On
sure.
that point, where's the evidence that the Israeli communists tried to link up quite closely with the Palestinians to fight the common enemy? I don't see that.
This is a party for all its history up until today, which is part of the joint list, is an Arab-Jewish party. This is how they call themselves. They have Arab members, Palestinian members, and they have Jewish members. Since 1924, when they are accepted to the Comintern, the Communist Party have Palestinian members. The ratio, the number, we don't know the number exactly, but the numbers change over the years, but it's self-consciously an Arab-Jewish party that always advocated, in all kinds of forms, always advocated the rights of Palestinians. There are times that this tension between these two nationalities that are represented within the party was not, they couldn't contain it. So there are splits. There are very deep and long-standing splits. The one in '65 that I'm talking about, that SNE is taking, that SNE is in large part responsible for. It's a split basically between the majority of the Jewish comrades and the Palestinian and some Jewish, and the Palestinian comrades and some Jewish communists, okay? So it's not an easy relationship, but it is a continued relationship between the Palestinian communists and Jewish communists. So that's the best answer. They are committed not to Palestinian nationalism exactly, but to internationalism in a way that Jews and Arabs can work together, live together, sometimes marry together, okay? Sometimes marry and have social relations. That's the essence of the party. Yeah.
Why the split?
Why the split in '65? There are mounting tensions between the Palestinian and Jewish members of the party. In the spark that starts it all is a speech by Ahmed Ben Bella, which was the head of the Algerian state after the French left, an Algerian revolutionary, where he basically says that Israel should be wiped out of the earth, And Moshe Mikunis, which is the Jewish general secretary of the party, writes in the party newspaper. He writes something against it. He writes an article against it, and in the Arab newspaper of the party called Al Ittihad, the Union, they refuse to publish it, and that sparks the tensions that already existed beneath the surface.
They refused to write.
They refused to publish what
response.
Mikunis wrote, and then all
It
the
was the party journal.
it's the party newspaper. They still have a party.
There's two.
There's two, one in Hebrew, one in English, one in Arabic.
One in Arabic, okay. And so he wrote a letter.
He wrote
In
an article
response to
that says
an article,
response to
right.
Ahmed Ben Bella. It's called the letter to Ahmed Ben Bella.
And so that was published, but
It was published
that
in
was-
Hebrew, and they
Arab-
refused. Yeah, the Palestinian members, that the editors.
Because-
Amir Habibi, I
yeah.
think, in
They-
particular,
they
said we are
refused-
not writing that the Algerian Revolution is sacred or something.
Why did they refuse?
It's 1964-65. The Algerian Revolution. They have they had their own reasons, and this is sort of explode everything, including bad personal relationship within the political bureau of the party, the governing party, the governing.
But why do you say that he was responsible for the split?
Because
I mean,
it starts with Mikunis, but Snare really pushes for it, pushes for the split. He pushes for the split, and it's an amazing split because communist parties are very monolithic. Nothing goes, it's a communist party. It's centralist democracy, and suddenly on the newspapers and it is also an ideological split. On the newspapers of Kol Ha'am, of the people's voice, you see they call it opinion A and opinion B. And suddenly you have in the Communist Party two opinions for a while. There is a democracy there for a while, and every comrade, Comrade Gviritz from Kol Yehuda has something to say. So he writes it in a letter to the newspaper and says, we have to be. The idea, when it comes to ideology, the Jewish comrades said that we have to recognize Zionism as a national movement without being Zionists. And the Palestinian comrades said that the only way to peace is that Israel detached itself from imperialism. Okay? So it was an
they
ideological,
didn't want-
political, personal, everything exploded and they split up.
Thanks very much. Amir, in response to us, they saw the possibility for national coexistence, if you will, and collaboration, or did they look at these people as nationless people sharing the common class identity? I mean, as communist, as a good communist, that's what you should see. You don't see a Jew, you don't see an Arab, you see the worker.
Yeah.
Is that the case? And I have
That's
another.
the paradox. This is the paradox. Is the Communist Party a vehicle to express the national, in some sort of way, the national aspirations of the Palestinian in Israel? And in many ways, in the 1950s and 60s, it is the only legitimate vehicle. Or is it a vehicle to express also class interests? I still need to know, and it's a question. It's a question that I haven't seen in the literature, the little literature that is. What draws the Palestinians to the party? The common answer is, since
You mean the Arabs?
the Arabs, the Palestinians in Israel after 48. What drove the party by the from 1955 to the late 1960s become a mass party among the Palestinians in Israel, and basically the representative. Okay, basically until today they are the largest ones. The sort of the short answer is no. The party is only a way for the Palestinians under the military government, which basically curtails their political expression, especially of nationalism. It's the only legitimate way for them to do it. I don't think so. I think the party also answered or also catered to class needs of the Palestinian in Israel as they become proletarian, as they are detached from the soil because of, of Israeli expropriation, and so on and so forth. And I think class, we haven't analyzed yet how much class still plays a part in the Communist Party beyond the great national questions, the conflict between the people.
How, if I may, for clarification, how active among the Palestinian community were the Arab communists? In other
Very
words,
much.
are we talking about a small group of people, or are we talking about a large group?
It depends. I mean, in the 1920s, they are really a small group. There isn't a large Palestinian working class. But the Palestinian communists in the 1940s are very crucial in organizing a very lively Palestinian working class and a union movement. They have their own union called the Union of Arab Workers, the Arab Workers Congress, it's called, that exists in Israel until 1953 at least, even after 1948. After 1948, remember, the Nakba basically is also a crisis of leadership. There isn't any leadership to the 160,000 Palestinians that stays within Israeli borders after 48. So the only activists, the only one that have organizational resources, that have the backing of the Jewish Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians. So they are become the leadership. They are the opposition, the only opposition to the military government. There is an interesting PhD that I'm reading now about Nazareth, the only Palestinian city that stayed intact in Israel after 1948. And you see how Maki and other forces negotiate, oppose the Israeli state as it takes control after 48 over Nazareth. And you see how Maki is the opposition. This is the not very loyal opposition that runs everything from workers, worker rights, or basically class struggle of the people that work for the Nazareth municipality. Issues like where's the water of Nazareth going to come from? Bekorot, the Israeli water company, or their own well. All those issues in the local level, the Palestinian communists are very important.
Okay, but you're suggesting here that the Arab communists are concerned with being in opposition, as well as local concern with being in opposition to the military government.
Yeah.
But how active are they in seeking a partnership with the Jewish communists?
Both of them, and this is from my PhD, but during my PhD I showed that one of the things that really draws together both the Jewish and Palestinian comrades is the struggle, the joint struggle against the military government. And at the end, the struggle against the military government becomes, even Cherut is against the military government. From some political reason, but from real insistence of democratic values, okay? And there is something that they are very much, they are partner in this struggle. Maybe when the military government was nearing its end, 66, 65, that is one of the things that contributed to the split, because there wasn't this struggle that is so clear cut, that is so morally, simple that drew them together. Yeah. Thanks.
I think that, first of all, thank you very much for the lecture. It's a very interesting subject. You know how interested I am in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that it has a very important insight into various aspects of Israeli nationalism, including Palestinian nationalism, that I think that should be developed. But while I would like to say something general, your presentation of Stalin and Lenin shows how bankrupt, to a large extent, the whole Marxist approach to nationalism is. So many nationalist theories or nationalism theories are actually speaking about how Marxism actually missed the action of the 20th century, which is basically the action of nation and nation state. In relation to Israel, it is a very interesting way how the Israeli Jewish communists were able to recruit, in my mind, Palestinian to that aura of a kind of a international cooperation on the basis of class, but actually the practice of what has happened was that the Israeli Communist Party has created a very strong nationalist Palestinian identity using all that language. So to a large extent, the materialization of the Marxist approach into a very specific historical setting that is in Israel actually shows how many shortcomings are there in the Marxist approach to nationalism. So my question to you is basically, the Israeli Jewish communists actually were, to a large extent, a colonial imperialist elite overseeing and organizing, so-called, the Palestinians. To a large extent, the Israeli communists missed completely the Israeli Jewish working class in Palestine for the sake of organizing Palestinian as a working class. So to a large extent, Moshe Sneh was almost like all other East European Jews who migrated to Israel in their approach, both to the Palestinians and both to Arab Jews or Jews from Arab countries. So to a large extent, the Communist Party, despite its rhetoric, its praxis was a very much both colonialist and imperialist.
Okay, you're going on a paradox or a contradiction, Ran Gerstein, which is harping on. I don't think it's
Not only him,
not only him, but the contradiction between how a European colonial minority, how part of a European colonial minority can approach the colonized majority and recruit them while they are part of this same privileged minority in the case of the communists.
This is not my framing, but
I think it implies from what you're saying. I refer to another colonial process of becoming indigenous, of creating a local identity out of the process of colonialization, of settler colonialism. And this is what I'm referring here with Sneh. Sneh presents an option that comes out of the colonial process, but presents an option of an identity which is local. And that's what interests me. Even in the case of the Palestinian nationalism that the party, that you claim that the party sort of harps on or helps to develop, it's also local.
But national. Local but national.
Yeah, but saying that I'm an Israeli national and not a Jewish national, okay? Or I'm an Israeli Jewish national, it's also a national thing to say. At the same time, I can say I'm not a Zionist. I don't accept, the Jewish people. I don't accept the people in Montreal. We are the same.
Right.
Maybe we have,
This is a
culturally,
Marxist
maybe we have
approach.
some similarities. Culturally, maybe we have some similarities, but we are not a nation. There isn't a political construct between us. Okay? So that's what Sneh says. And that's a national thing to say. If this is a nationalism of the colonizing minority, yeah. But it's still local because it grows geographically and has features.
But it's not a
And
class
the
struggle,
locality,
it's a
which is
national
in-
struggle.
What?
But it's not a class struggle, it's a national struggle. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, but
what has developed
communists-
from the language and from the discourse is a national discourse.
Yeah, Mayor, but communist parties had national struggles, Vietnam, Cuba.
Exactly.
Communist, and that's what I'm showing here. If you take those really not universal but internationalist concepts, and you not twist them, but you fit them into local conditions, you can create all kinds of interesting things. You can create nationalism which is not sanctioned by, which is not sanctioned by the official national movement. Okay? That's the idea. So you have, a meeting point here, and harmonization even, I would say, between nationalism and internationalism. I know it's a difficult,
Go
Yeah.
ahead, please.
You said
Sorry.
that the Israeli side, the Jewish side, neglected the Jewish side and concentrated more on the Arab side. But there's a reason for it. The Arabs were under heavy pressure not to have anything to do with the Jews. As a matter of fact, the Statute, I remember, made tremendous effort to get membership of the Arab. And there was sort of a group which I call the missionaries. They were pressuring the Arabs constantly to avoid anything with Jews. And we saw a movie yesterday, and it shows the 3 women that made contact with Jewish women, and when they went public, they were boycotted by everything else. There had been pressure constantly. So it's no wonder that if Moshe Sneh, with his power, concentrated more on the Arab and neglected the Jewish side.
Any more questions? Yes, Shaba.
Two very quick ones. But the questions are quick. I don't know about the answers. Amir, the role of Soviet propaganda in all of this.
Not much, if you ask me. The Soviets are trying to penetrate to the area in the 1950s generally.
And that's when he writes.
Yeah,
He writes this piece in 1954.
in 1954.
And
But
as
by
you said, he writes
1954,
it
the
because
Soviet,
he wants to sell himself as an agent of the
19
Soviet
by
Union.
1954, Soviet-Israeli relations are cool.
Sure.
1948, there is, the Soviets are trying to, their idea is a big powers game, so they want to get into the Middle East because, there are of course the prizes of oil and, this massive human mass. But how much Soviet propaganda
In
plays?
Sneh, like the role of Soviet propaganda in Sneh's thinking.
In Sneh's thinking?
Because that's his goal, right? I mean, as you said earlier
He's
on.
not a vehicle for Soviet propaganda.
But that's why he
I
shifted.
know there was something
That's
in
why
the
he
newspapers,
switched.
even this year, that he was a Soviet agent.
But he
Oh, was
translated, he translated
But
it
All
in-
it's not
communists
like-
were.
it's
All
not like-
communists were all over the block.
Now the atmosphere is in Palestine.
Yeah, but he wasn't, no. He was,
He's not Mapai.
he's not Mapai. Definitely not. But first of all, the Soviets were more interested of recruiting people in Mapam, because Mapam was more influential. Who, give anything about Maki, which is sidelined, and the Soviets knew it very well. And no less than Isar Harel himself said, I'm pretty sure that Sneh is not a Soviet agent, because there was a lot to talk about. There was a newspaper article that said that Sneh was on the list of the KGB because some defector said it, but the KGB, a little bit like the Israeli police, likes to exaggerate his successes or his stories. So it's highly unlikely that he was this tool of Soviet. He really, as a politician, as a leader, took a decision, which I think was authentic to him, that the Soviet Union is a rising power, and we need to align ourselves. We were in the 1950s. You know the Cold War very well. It could go either way. The United States was not the base, was not the obvious. Things could go, people fought. Things could go otherwise. In the 1950s, for at least communist parties, 54, before 56, the crimes of Stalin are not yet revealed. For instance, there isn't Hungary yet, which basically destroys Western communism in Western Europe and whatever they have in the United States. So those things are not yet, things are undetermined yet. And there is, and let's not take from what the United States is doing in the Cold War. This is a country which is doing some unfair dealings, to say the least. And I think they had legitimate causes or legitimate reasons to bet on the Soviet card. And also, in the case of Sneh, Sneh is a very Jewish Hasidic Jew. He knows Yiddish. He grows up in a Hasidic house. I remember I read a newspaper clip that suddenly he finds two Hakim, that is known as Knesset, in the cafeteria of the Knesset, two religious members of Knesset, and they start to go into Talmud. And he says, I'm a Hasidic, I'm not a mitnaged. He understands completely what he says. And he has this thing about class, about social justice, which is really part of his writing and part of his thinking. It's not all about, we need to ensure the survival of the state of Israel. And in that sense, he stays communist to the last. He said communism is without the repression, everything is for social justice. And for that, he stays loyal until his death.
Loyal to
this idea of social justice that is embodied in communism.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
I want to answer in the atmosphere in Palestine during World War II and shortly after was very pro-Russian.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of movies and songs and everything. After all, we realized that the West was not very pro-Jewish. The Russian gave the impression, at least, that they were on our side. So it was easier.
Don't you see the irony that a communist party had contributed so much to the Israeli-Palestinian national perception?
I see the irony in a sense, and I also see that communists are for the oppressed, and Palestinian nationalism and Palestinians per se are the oppressed. Also economically.
So it's interesting that
you advocate
the Israeli history of the Communist Party had created a very strong Palestinian definition of nationhood, whereas it left the Israeli Jewish side of it almost an orphan, because they don't want to belong to the Zionist nationalist perception on the one hand.
What do you accept to be Zionist?
No, I'm not accepting anything. It's not my wish list. I'm just looking at the irony of what has developed.
Yeah,
I mean the Israeli communists, you mean?
Yeah, the Israeli Jewish communists are actually orphans. They try to somehow relate to the Palestinian
on class lines.
But basically the Palestinian line is a nationalist or a national line. So in a way they are speaking the Marxist language. The product is a national product.
Yeah.
It's a really ironic, to some extent, paradoxical. But
Can one argue that because the Israeli Jewish communists were showing this attitude toward the Palestinians, that prevented the Labour Party, which is traditionally a leftist party, from having a pro-Palestinian bias? In other words, if the communists are taking that corner of saying it's our job to identify with the Palestinians and to protect their rights, does this negatively impact on what the other parties are going to do?
I'll contend the fact that the Labour Party, to its various manifestations, used to be the hegemonic party, is a leftist party, by any means, or even socialist party. The split between socialist internationalist and socialist Zionist in the even before the 1920s, is on that question. Do we create a union like the history drew? Do we create this whole, Chavrat Avdim, this whole society of workers only for Jews, or do we include Palestinians? And the Zionist socialist that would evolve into the Labour Party says resoundingly, it's only for Jews. So
the question is, why are they saying that? As I'm asking, are they saying that because somebody else is already...
Because they are not socialists.
They're not socialists, they are nationalists. They are nationalists first.
their main approach was to be a Zionist, to create a nation
state for
with
Jews.
a nation national identity in Israel. That's what they have done.
But maybe to go to back very quickly to your notion of the orphaned Israeli Jewish communist, and I was trying to probe Amir in a private conversation before, and maybe this is a good public forum to bring it up. I mean, there was an attempt. I mean, if you think of the Hebrew communists, I mean, there was a very interesting attempt at actually molding a very Zionist, national, but also communist identity together. Now it falls by the wayside.
Yeah, it was fallen by the wayside because it didn't have any validity at the end.
Listen, the Jewish communists
when-
wanted to educate the Palestinian on class, language, and discourse. They failed. They had a national development. The Jewish communists completely ignored the Jewish working class, who was from Arab country. So in a way, they were an intellectual elite that preached to people who adopted some of their language to create a national identity, and they forgot
we don't
a
know.
class struggle within Israel. So the class struggle was actually, their major effort was supposedly to create a class struggle between Jewish working class and Palestinian working, but they did not do that. That was their major mission as Marxists and socialists, but they failed in that mission. Not only with regard to the Palestinian, but they failed also with regard to the Jewish working class. So it's an ironic development that the Marxist approach, a complete bankruptcy with regard to nationalism, but also in regard to its politics within Israel.
I don't think it's that. First of all, we don't know. You know what? Nobody, and I'm thinking someday I'll do that. Nobody tried to really look at the connections between the Israeli working class and the Communist Party. How much they managed to have some influence. They are part of the Histadrut since the 1940s, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of, from what I'm seeing, just from the documents, there is a lot of orientation towards class, towards even the Jewish regulars. How much? I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Well, very,
But they were not answered
we
yet.
know it's very.
Forget some. The kibbutz movement this time was very strong, also the Moshav movement. And it was considered that we were part and offspring of the improvement of the Russian system. So therefore it was very pro-Russian everything.
They were pro what?
We were more pro-Russian. than
Well, but the
everything.
kibbutz never accepted Arabs to the kibbutz.
No, not this.
They were pro-Russian, but they were
The kibbutz movement was
they were
very strong at
nationalists
the
at that
time. And so was the Moshav
Indeed, they were
movement.
very strong, but they
And
were
it was sort of
clearly
like an
an
offspring
anti-Arab.
of
anti-Palestinian.
of a newer improvement
Okay.
system.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Amir.